And if we zoom in a little bit closer, we can see also that the size of the tail that follows, so the Hong Kong peak here, is a lot larger than the tail that follows the Warsaw peak there. And what that basically is showing that the Hong Kong Internet Exchange is a lot older than the Warsaw Exchange. So members there have had a lot longer to be able to set up bilateral sessions, thus increasing their pairing session counts. So over time, we'd expect to see that you'd see a similar longer tail come out of the Warsaw peak there. So a few unexpected results came out of the survey. The first was that multilateral pairing was far more prevalent than we expected. So historically, multilateral pairing has been thought of as something that only the smaller networks do. But it appears from the results we've got here that it's very, very common. Of course, the data collection method that we have here doesn't allow for a comparison of the absolute number of bilateral sessions versus the multilateral ones, but we can draw some observations. So firstly, we could see that the majority of AS peers were connected through an MLPA route server. And many of these agreements were very large, ranging from dozens to hundreds of participants. So they're pretty active. Okay, so multilateral pairing in some sense appears to be taking over from bilateral pairing, at least in sheer numbers, but probably not in the actual volume of traffic. So multilateral pairing's no longer really something on the periphery of the internet. It seems to be relatively important these days. So as an example, if we take the Hong Kong Internet Exchange, they've got 144 participants, or at least they did when we wrote the report, which represented over 10,000 AS peer adjacencies. Putting that into perspective, that means each and every participant at the HKIX, they individually have a higher degree of interconnection than any of the Tier 1 carriers, right? Because every participant is connected to at least 143 other networks. So I'm not sure if this has been used a lot in the marketing from ISPs, but if you're wanting to show your degree of interconnectivity in a region, you can easily show yourself to be far better than any of the big carriers. Okay, so this next graph shows the number of advertised prefixes up the vertical axis over the number of interconnection partners that they have. Now, we can see here that there are of the networks that advertise, that have a very, very small number of interconnections there. So you might be looking at, say, up to about 10 or 15 peers, right? They have the vast majority of advertised prefixes there. So that pretty much represents the Tier 1 carriers. So the Tier 1 carriers advertise many, many prefixes, but they only interconnect with a very tiny number of ASs, right? Which kind of matches with the definition of a Tier 1 carrier, where they only peer with other Tier 1 carriers. So it's by definition a very small group. And then if we look at a similar graph, but in this case, that should be advertised addresses there. We can see when we're looking at the actual number of advertised addresses, there is, again, the Tier 1 showing up here. The majority of addresses are advertised by them, and they have a very, very small number of interconnections. And again, we can see the impact of some of the MLPA route servers around, showing us these bands in the graph there. Of course, if we extrapolate these charts, then if the Tier 1 carriers were to follow the average correspondence we see between size and degree of interconnection, then they'd have to have many thousands of peers, which they obviously don't have. If we take a look at any large content distribution networks, they have a very similar scale and degree of infrastructure investment, yet they display very broad interconnectivity in both absolute numbers and geographic diversity. So it's an expected result, but it's the difference between the two is several orders of magnitude higher than we were expecting. So that was kind of interesting. And future work, there's relatively few mechanisms to make any direct comparisons with what we've done in this first survey, because there's no objective ground truth or pre-existing data set that we can easily compare to. There have been previous studies that have looked at similar sorts of things, but they tend to be very, very focused, so not very useful for a comparison. So we're hoping that this survey will become a semi-regular event, possibly happening every year or every couple of years, which will give us a sort of a visualization over time of what's happening. And of course, the hope here is that academics might follow up with further work in this area. So that's everything that came out of our survey here. I guess, do we want to take one or two questions now, or wait till the end?
Yeah, the large amount of data. So, on the one hand, so for folk in the room here, how useful is it for them? What will they gain from this operationally and so forth? And also, just from PCH's point of view, how do you manage to analyze this amount of data in this period of time?
Right. Okay. So, firstly, I guess what's probably most important to people here is the first two things here. So, firstly, is the number of informal agreements compared to formal. So, a common response when you're asking for peering could be that somebody wants to make it a very formal contractual relationship or impose some conditions on it. So at least this shows that on the data set we looked at least, which was pretty comprehensive, the vast majority, 99.5% odd, of agreements are informal. So that might be some ammunition you can use to help get in peering. And the same way, the number of symmetric term agreements there as well. So this is all sort of information that might help when it comes to obtaining peering with others. As far as the data processing and acquisition went, obviously a lot of these respondents were sending thousands of tuples of information to us. So in that case, they were actually sending, I think it was tab delimited text files, and this was all pulled into some scripts that went through and processed all the data that we got. So once the scripts were created, it was pretty easy to run analysis on the data.
Yes, we have Eddie at the back.
Yes, you say that you did this survey by asking operators some questions. Could it be tied to the fact that those who answered are actually those who do open things, and they would not? That's why they have so many handshakes, and those who have a tendency to hide things don't go on contract and they don't respond to this type of survey.
Yeah, there's a natural bias there, I guess, towards that. On the other hand, because for every peering relationship, we only had to get one end of that information, by the same token, you could see if you had a closed peer on one end and an open peer on the other, we're probably likely to get that information from the other end. But yeah, it's quite likely that there is a bunch of data there that we're not seeing and not getting responses to. It's probably possible to infer some of that by looking at AS paths for the various prefixes and sort of infer whether it's a peering between some tier 1 carriers or a peering elsewhere. But given the number of, or is it on in terms of response here, the number of different ASs that we got responses for shows it's pretty comprehensive. Of course, if that other 14% is all the closed networks, then yeah, it could be quite skewed. So this is only something I think that can easily be determined with future iterations and comparisons.